If anyone doesn't want their voice or image recorded, do not step into this area. And there is a room mic, so it'll pick up questions. So if you prefer not to be on the live stream, then you can come up to me afterwards. There we go. I think we're
ready. Okay, so thank you everyone for coming to the second seminars of the Global Challenges Archaeology and Heritage theme. Today we're talking about gender inequality, and I am incredibly pleased to welcome my good friend Brenna Hassett. Turns out I didn't know all of the stuff she did, so I have a little note here. Brenna is a bioarchaeologist who completed her undergrad at UCLA's Costin Institute in Archaeology before coming to UCL to do her master's in archaeology when we met, and her PhD in dental anthropology on health and development in post-medieval London. She's worked on a range of projects, both in the field and in the lab, in places such as Egypt, Turkey, and Greece, just to name a few. She's a scientific associate at the museum, the Natural History Museum, and returned to the IOA in 2018 as a co-PI with David Wengrow on the HRC-funded project Radical Death. She's part of Trailblazers, which, as many of you probably know, is a grassroots activist organization dedicated to highlighting the contribution of women to the earth sciences. But she's also author of this fantastic book, Built on Bones. So yes, this is her title, and I'll let her introduce herself. Thank you.
I paid Hannah $5 to say that. Is this a clicker?
Yeah. That's a
mic.
I don't know if there's a clicker. I think there are clickers here.
That might. Anyway,
do you need a mic?
I can use a keyboard. So this session will be audio recorded, so I apologize for anyone who has trouble hearing me without the audio currently. I know that it's poor form not to have this mic'd, but I don't have to work that, and I apologize. Anyhow, yes, so Hannah very kindly asked me to be part of this strategic global challenges conversation, and I came up with a weird title and then had to come up with something to talk about to it. So this is what we've got to. And what I want to talk about is talking, sort of. So just the structure, I'm just going to go through a little bit of history, tiny bit of theory, and of course, a lot of women. These are various screenshots of some of the archaeologists we feature on Trailblazers, which, if I get time, I will talk about later. But I want to talk about the way we talk about women in archaeology. So we kind of have two women in archaeology bits. There's archaeology, women in the past, i.e. their role in the past. And then there's women now. And these are separate things, and we must never mix them up because, of course, one is gender theory and one is not. Or is it? So we're going to talk a little bit just about ways we talk about women in the past. You can see the lovely, eloquent bones of Abu Huraira, and sort of a woman carefully grinding things. Women, of course, did not exist until the Neolithic, and they could be safely pictured indoors. But we're also going to talk about women in archaeological practice, which is something I'm a little more interested in because I think it needs a little more help. And we're going to talk about it in terms of then, now, and later. And I've chosen a picture of Hilda Petrie, who's taken off her skirt to go climbing around some pyramids. This is fellow trailblazer Susie Birch, who's pregnant in the field in this Guardian photo. And of course, this beautiful image from the Motel of the Mysteries, which I recommend everyone read. It's about the excavation of the 1980s American motel. Anyhow, the way I want to talk about this is actually fairly data-centered. I have a lot of conversations as part of my work with Trailblazers and the whole existing as a woman thing about women in archaeology. And there are ways of quantifying some of this stuff that I think we can use. Also, archaeology is the science that steals every other science. So we have stolen bibliometrics in this case. So these are the bibliometric sort of things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about things like word frequency in documents, so patterns in publication, frequently used terms. I'm going to talk about themes and topics, so words that get used over again. And I'm also going to talk about citation networks, and citation networks are particularly interesting. These are groups of people who cite each other, or groups of citations that are always cited. So there's a lot of interesting work. It's slowly coming into archaeology. Tom Brugman, apologies if I didn't pronounce that right, is doing some really interesting stuff that's coming out soon. And influence. It matters. So we're going to try and get through that. This is a very stupidly complicated software pipeline involving R, and I can talk about that later if anyone wants. So, talking about women in the past. Obviously, those can't be women because they're not indoors. And thanks to Matt Pope for his online gallery of images of women looking pensive in human evolution. So obviously, we do talk about women in the past, and this has been a long-term trend. The way we talk about them is sometimes interesting. One of my favorite versions of the specific evolutionary anthropology of women is Colin Mithen's Man the Toolmaker. The theory being that Acheulean axes, which by the way show up in lots, there's a lot of them when you find them, are essentially a peacock's tail. Acheulean axes not used for axing, they're for impressing the ladies. Bet you didn't know that. Therefore, again, so man the toolmaker, woman the tool judger. So there have been theories about women in the past for some time. And there are even more interesting theories if you want to go into the realm of evolutionary psychology, which I don't, but I did have to pick this particular favorite out. Apparently, women prefer pink because it helps them gather ripe fruit or pick healthy mates. Given that we kind of only invented white people fairly recently, I don't know when the pink people happened. I find this fascinating. Anyhow, this is why you need to be careful with evolutionary psychology. So, yes, that is not, perhaps, the way to talk about women in the past. But people do. And I'm just going to run through, this is actually my nativity set, which is sort of thematic. But I'd like to talk about who does the talking about women in the past and how they do it. Let's start with a favorite. Charles Darwin, who pointed out that women, even though they're good at intuition, rapid perception, possibly even imitation, those are things that are associated with the lower races, so they're not really skill sets. Thank you, Darwin. And I want to particularly talk about more bad evolutionary science. In this case, Elaine Morgan. So many people probably don't know who Elaine Morgan is because you don't believe that we evolved from aquatic apes, which is good, you shouldn't, we didn't. But Elaine Morgan was a sort of popular writer, a popular science writer, and had a fairly impressive career writing about things. And the thing that really stuck with audiences was her insistence on popularizing this theory that humans had an aquatic period of evolution. Okay, that's as maybe, but what she also did was write a book called The Descent of Woman. The 1970s went crazy with this man the hunter thing, Raymond Dart, everyone was running around talking about men, men, men. And Elaine Morgan wrote a book called Descent of Woman, asking what would evolution look like if we talked about the evolution of woman. It's actually quite a feminist book. It is not as wrong as Aquatic Ape. It has much more to sort of, recommend it. And you can, and it's sort of, sits out there as a pretty resolutely feminist work in terms of evolutionary anthropology. And you can also tell this is a word cloud representation of, this is taking the entire document and looking at the most frequent words. And you can tell that this is a very different kind of document. If you look at normal evolutionary anthropology, you have some sort of sexual dimorphism or something like that. But this is very female-centered. You've got the word female, women. She also includes, she uses the word mother, she uses behavior, young, or baby, and talks about certain aspects of evolution that other people don't ask. You can also tell that she's British because she uses quite and and may an obscene number of times. So how do we talk about Elaine Morgan? We talk about the stuff she was wrong about. We talk about aquatic ape. And so, this is where she ends up. She ends up in a citation ghetto. So this is a co-citation network. This is what happens when you look at all of the works that cite descended women. So what could have been a fairly non-scientific, per se, but at least interesting thought experiment of a book, only ends up being cited alongside Desmond Campbell, and they're writing about aquatic ape. So that little red network is her being fully ghettoized into the unlikely aquatic ape scenario. And which means that basically her network, her citations, the way we talk about her work is fully aquatic ape. You can thank the Daily Mail for that photo, by the way. Obviously, we do talk about gender in the past. This is a major, major subject in archaeology. It's something we talk about a lot. Or is it? We'll get to that. But it sort of kicks off in the early 70s. This published by Arnold and Wicker. By the way, those are both women. Focuses on gender in the archaeology of death, so bioarchaeology in particular, because it's dealing with bodies and because it's dealing with differences in social roles reflected in, its individuals, does deal with gender quite a bit. So it's unsurprising bioarchaeology creeps in there. And we also start to see these co-publishing networks, groups of people who are working on gender. So this is the results of going through Google Scholar, which is about the most comprehensive citation index you can get. And so 49 years of gender archaeology. These are works with gender and archaeology explicitly bias. There's other things going on, but this is about as good as we can get. With a total of 9,891 citations of those papers. So there is a corpus out there. This is a real thing. I'll have a brief look at who is doing the talking about gender in the past, or women in the past, if that's really what we mean. And very unsurprisingly, so this is an order of citations. So you have Meg Conkey and Janet Spector at the very top with 1984, Archaeology and the Study of Gender. I didn't put the full titles. You can certainly come and ask me. I have them in a different slide. But so Conkey, Gilchrist, Sorensen, Brumfield, not Brumfeld, just note that. Baxter, Nelson, Conkey, Giro again. And little hint there, all of those people are women. All of them. That is the structure. And mad props to Doug Price, Thomas Jackson, Peter White. This is the 1988 conference on women in production prehistory that a lot of these early discussions about gender and archaeology sort of kicked off from. But as you might notice, it is a large number of women. And what are they talking about? Well, works that are talking about gender and archaeology are generally talking about women. That is the next most common word used. They're also talking about power. They're talking about culture. They're probably talking about material culture. That's why those words are right next to each other. They're talking about class. And of course, they're talking about feminism. If you really want to trace this, you can actually do, this is a thematic evolution map. Do not bother trying to read the tiny things because they are not perfect. But basically, what this is saying is that we start using the word gender and archaeology in about 1971. We are still using the word women for similar and related papers from the 80s to the mid-90s. In the mid-90s, we start having basically conferences, and we start sort of spreading all of this out. So we start making sort of distinctions. We start getting specific sort of theoretical approaches or class-based approaches we start broadening out the spectrum of things we're talking about in gender archaeology. And this is reflected in kind of, one of these word frequency maps where we're talking about all of these things: identity, sexuality, race, feminism, colonialism, backed by archaeology. The same stuff is represented here, where you have essentially, you have this is a tree map. So imagine that these are branches. Gender, archaeology, and these are all tied in with the larger concepts of identity, race, sexuality, and feminism. And then they break down into these smaller and smaller categories until you start getting, here's the Bronze Age, here's the Andes, very small, specific field approaches. So this is that same data basically run for the last 10 years, sort of made into a log distribution. And what I just want to point out here is that those are all those words again. And now to sort of the beginning of that, we're using words that are talking about archaeological practice. We're talking about feminist stuff, we're talking about pedagogy, we're talking about narrative, we're talking about reflexivity. This is that post-processual multivocality. This is what we're doing. And what are we doing in 2018? We are also talking about practice, but what we're talking about now is discrimination. We're talking about the experience of women in archaeology, which brings us to our next section. So this is the second part, which is talking about women in archaeology. And we did talk about women in archaeology. This lovely quote, you cannot tell them to go out into the soil, this is against their delicate nature, comes from a president of a certain Turkish-speaking country, and prompted a hashtag response, which has a lot of images of women digging, because apparently that is a thing that they can do. And of course, Sally Binford has a quote for that, as she does for everything, which I always love. I'm not here to cook, I am here to dig. But, so let's talk about women in archaeology then, now, and later. So then, there have been women in archaeology, or whatever you want to call archaeology. That's Helena of Constantinople, who sent a bunch of people to Jerusalem to recover bits of True Cross. She had the money, she had the influence, she could do it. That is Mary Bruce, Countess of Elgin. You may have heard of what she took out of that particular corner of the Eastern Mediterranean. So we have a lovely history of women appropriating old things. Then we have adventures in empire, which the French and the British particularly good at this, but the Americans gave them a run for it. Gertrude Bell, which many people will have heard of because there was a Nicole Kidman film, ran around looking at interesting things and messing with the Iraqi succession, which did not work out long term, but hey, she didn't know. And then this is Jane de la Foy, who is a personal favorite. She followed her husband out into railroad business when France was expanding railroads, kind of stumbled on Susa archaeology, thought this was nice. She also cross-dressed as a man to become a sharpshooter in her husband's regiment during whenever they were fighting the Franco-Persian War. And so she sort of, and then she became this sort of bon vivant raconteur in the salons of Paris, and actually received professional, an official document giving her official French government permission to cross-dress, which you could get in those days. So she could wear men's clothing and still write all the papers. And then, of course, we come into slightly more of the modern era. Chosen some UCL examples here. There's Kathleen Kenyon, obviously, with a puppy. She's very fond of dogs. I think everyone knows who Kathleen Kenyon is. She's made a Dane. She apparently used to terrify people running up and down these holes with dogs. And it's my favorite picture of Margaret Murray and Hilda Petrie. Hilda Petrie married to a slightly more famous Petrie. And Margaret Murray there, Margaret Murray being the woman who was so amazingly underpaid for her work that her students had to buy her graduation robes when UCL finally conceded they would give her a PhD some 20 years after she started teaching. But she also apparently won World War I by putting a hex on the Kaiser. She was an expert in prehistoric religion. So, you know, there's some achievements there. But these are the early entrants into the academy, and they're associated with UCL, which of course let women in before other universities did, hence we got them. But there is actually a much longer term, and I always think this is a really interesting graph. This is from Archaeology, Sex and Scandal by Kaiser. And there were actually a lot more professional women archaeologists in the academy. And then the numbers crashed again. There's quite an interesting post-war, this is in America, but this is 1890s, basically, 1900, and then decade. So the 1920s to the 1930s sees a peak in female PhD students and instructors, employees of universities. And then it crashes in the post-war years for a variety of social reasons. But we get people like Orma Butler, who this quote is from, and the only important thing there is she's giving an interview in about 1929 to University of Michigan School Paper. And she's saying, you know, many people think that women can't be archaeologists, but they can. It is hard for them, of course, especially if they're not used to manual labor. In addition, in some countries, they're regarded unkindly by the natives and made to suffer the pains of all women pioneers. So she did get some colonialism in there, but the ethos is there. So there were women certainly digging. 1929 is an all-female exhibition to Great Zimbabwe. There's an all-female exhibition dig in New Mexico in the States at the same time. So it does happen. Right. Professional archaeology, which I'm just going to say is now, even though this picture is somewhat aged. Some people in this room will recognize some people here. And that is, and I just noticed actually that is a sort of male skewed picture, but I'm taking the photo, so it's actually 50-50. So who is an archaeologist now? So I don't know if anyone is familiar with the Profiling the Profession series, but this is work by Kenneth Aitchison and Doug Ross-McQueen, and they basically have done a couple repeated surveys, and another one is coming soon, about who works in archaeology. What jobs do they do? How much do they get paid? And they break it down by age, by gender, by race. And this is from 2013. But we can see the lines are converging. How exciting. That looks like equality. I mean, that's pretty decent. You don't need to know these numbers, but okay, field work is still skewed male. Museum work still skewed way female. But academic, almost completely equal. That sounds good. And look, the problem is fixing itself. As the older male-dominated cohorts die out or are slowly shuffled out of the building, younger women who make up more of the undergraduate and, well, basically, I think up to PhD, it's more women. Someone can correct me on that. You know, we're slowly correcting the balance. Or is it? This is from 2015. This is a picture of Hannah Cobb, who's chair of the SEPA Equality and Diversity Group. This group was started in response to perceived barriers to staying in the profession. And you don't start a group like this, and it takes a lot of time, without those barriers being real and present. People still find, this is her version of a word cloud, which I felt I had to add, that equality, diversity were still major issues in 2015. So there are additional steps being taken to make sure that we are not losing underrepresented groups, especially women. So problem solved, right? Yeah. There's Hannah Cobb in December on the same kind of panel that I do, that she does, that British women archaeologists, that Rachel Coke and Heather do, Kate Hawkins there. And that's us talking about the problems faced by women in archaeology today. So, right, let's go back to talking about. That makes a lot of sense. Who talks explicitly about women in archaeology. It is largely women, as you may have noticed on that panel. That is a womanal. What's a woman version of a mammal? Womanal. And it's not like this hasn't been happening for some time. So Joan Duro is sort of amazing body of work on this, but talking about a lot of different field-based things. And of course, this is Breaking Ground, which is a series looking at women archaeologists. This is actually from 3 Institute authors, so that's Sue Hamilton, Ruth Whitehouse, and Karen Ryan, talking about the history of women in archaeology. And of course, I've thrown in the Trailblazers logo because we try and do some of that too. Who do we talk about when we talk about the history of women in archaeology? Well, we talk about the same people. We talk about, there's Margaret Murray. We love Margaret Murray. The story about the Kaiser is hilarious. And she unrolled mummies. I mean, that's weird. It's very strange. She's a very interesting person. Her biography was called, it was published when she was 99, by the way. It's called My First 100 Years. I have a lot of respect for her, but why are we only talking about Margaret Murray? And then Edwards there, 1877, that's Amelia Edwards. She writes popular histories of Egypt. She's the one who bankrolled Flinders Petrie's chair. She's the moneybags interest that got Egyptology so embedded at UCL. That's great, but she's been dead for some time. One of the other favorites there is Droop. So that's G.P. Droop, who in 1915 came up with some fascinating, he had an entire chapter devoted to women in the field and his thoughts. I do not believe that such close and unavoidable companionship can ever be other than a source of irritation. At any rate, I believe that however it may affect women, the ordinary male at least cannot stand it. So that's what we're quoting, which is good. That's interesting. So, sorry, like half of those quotes, half of those citations are probably me because I use that very frequently. So we talk about women in archaeology, and we kind of talk about the practice, but it's a small, limited group of women talking about it. We talk a little bit about gender, we talk a little bit about various sections, so classical archaeology, European archaeology, conferences about women excavating, but this is a big mixed bag. So that's how we're talking about women, that's who the women are. What about later? What do we teach? And this I offer with apologies to the persons teaching on the Introduction to Archaeology course. So this is the result of me text mining the course handbook for the Introduction to Archaeology. Because I would like to, this is the big intro class that everyone has to go through that teaches you what you need to learn about archaeology. You might learn it in a different class, but this is what you need to learn. So what do you need to learn? Stuff about London, stuff about heritage. Desk issue is obviously a reference to whether you can get at the desk or not. There's Andrew Reynolds, as mentioned several times, he's the course coordinator. Fine. That seems good. I mean, I don't know. But this is a perfectly reasonable selection of items. Neither of the words gender or theory show up. Anthropology does. Okay. Who do we teach? Every single bibliographic reference offered as course reading in the undergraduate introduction course. This is the percentage of women cited. There's one person who teaches on that course in this room. I'm sorry, stop being you. It's 15%. That is how many women we know of in the whole world. Like that's okay. We are the biggest department, I think, in Europe, possibly in the world. We are one of the most diverse. We have a female director. And to be fair to the introduction course, this introduction course is handed down like from year on year on year, and people make tiny incremental changes depending on who's. So this is not a planned. There's multiple people teaching multiple different subjects. So this is not a gotcha on any particular instructor or poor course coordinator. There is no blame here because this stuff gets handed down for like the last 30 years. But wow, 15%. Who teaches who? Female instructors teach many more female authors. So the percentages you're seeing there is the percentage of authors. If you break it down as, you got a paper with 4 authors, 2 are male, 2 are female. What percentage of authors per reading are female? Yeah, the women teach more female. They cite more references from female authors. The NA there, by the way, is the sort of background course reading. It's not any particular instructor, it's just like the essentials. And it does even worse than either. Okay, so we know that females cite more bibliographic evidence. Is this something that's changing? Does this depend on the individual instructor, sort of their tradition, whether they're going, whether they're teaching material that they might have come up with a long time ago? So this is years the instructor has been research active. So more or less the years of experience of that research instructor. So less than 5, more than 10, and then 20, 30, 40, and then just the background course reading. So it's not an age bracket issue. That has probably work out who has more than 40 years experience and teaches, and they do great at citing women. So it's not specifically that. Is who we cite related to other what people in bibliometric group called power moves? One of the ways of enforcing your network is, of course, to ensure that the right people are cited. Male instructors do tend to self-cite. This has been found in almost every other discipline. It has been true in basically anywhere they've done bibliometric analysis. This is pretty well established. Right? Is it subject specific? Are there certain subjects where we have no female authors? Yes! That's obviously not true. And to be fair, people choose citations very different ways, people teach in very idiosyncratic ways. But it is noticeable. Public archaeology and heritage, which I've grouped together. Apologies to the public archaeology and heritage people, but I put you together. Do quite well. There's a large number, and it's possible that public archaeology and heritage are newer disciplines. They are also far more involved with a lot of commercial and museum sector business, which, as we've talked about, the museum sector is already overbalanced towards women. Right, so that's what we teach. But you can have considerable amount of fun with canons. This is a little project that Trailblazers took on, which I certainly cannot take full credit for. But the newest version of Renfrew and Vaughan, which is the standard text for archaeology in the UK, Trailblazers was asked to have a little look and just offer a few comments about some of the ways things are phrased or presented. And so this is just a highlight of my margin notes, not actually what's represented in the text. But so there's a biography of Pitt Rivers, who has a big museum and a great beard. He is famous for his recording technique. That's what we teach. He did recording. That's on the text. But there's a Scottish lady who was doing stratigraphic drawing 5 years earlier and publishing it. You would have seen it. It was in the Society of Antiquaries Scotland. Petrie, we all know Petrie, again, beard, right. But Amelia Edwards bankrolled him. She literally endowed a chair and bossed everyone around until he got it. And his wife did most of the fundraising and tedious bits of actually getting his fantastic exhibition expeditions on ground. Wheeler did dig, we will all admit that. But poor Tessa, I mean, Wheeler, a difficult guy, you can read the biography on your own. But Tessa, his wife, sat there in the field and trained something like half of the working archaeologists through the 40s and 50s. I mean, she is a monumental sort of force in UK archaeology. And then, you know, Kathleen Kenyon came around and added box to everything, which, well, you can think what you want about that. But, so there are ways of talking about women in archaeology and what we teach in archaeology that don't necessarily have to be quite as male-centered, or at least that's what Trailblazer says. And, you know, who we talk about, who we think is canon, who we mention, whose work is worthwhile, which collaborations we either take part in ourselves or note, what impact those have, you know, those get reflected, and you can trace them out in these things like citation networks, and you can end up with, you know, the aquatic ape ghetto. Nobody wants to be in the aquatic ape ghetto. These networks exist. There are many different networks. This, for instance, is a network centered around Dorothy Garrett, who, very early famous first professor. She is basically passing down knowledge through social networks, through hiring people, through all of these people are linked through in some way. And they're all women. And all of them basically would not have gotten to where they got without some of their connections. There's Gertrude Catherine Thompson. She's the one who ran that 1929 all-female expedition to Great Zimbabwe. She needed someone to drive the car and someone who could do like could take photography, could take pictures. So she went back to the girls' school. That the headmistress of the girls' school and basically said, "Have you got anyone?" So they sent her this 16-year-old called Kathleen Kenyon. That worked. So these networks do exist, but we choose very much which ones we reference. We choose which ones we are integrated with ourselves, who we are working with, and basically what I would like to end with is that if we don't consciously think about what we are, how we are forming these networks, who we are citing, who we are allowing into our networks, then we run the danger of basically making them closed and inaccessible. And then Hannah Cobb has to keep on coming back to these stupid talks. This is our issues board from the tag session on women in power, and those are literally just lists of things that women in archaeology are still dealing with, and we are still spending a lot of our own free time dealing with. So yeah, I think the point there is that you need to we need to talk about who we're talking about.
Wow, amazing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I have no idea if I went over time, sorry.
You're fine. No clock, we're safe. Are there any questions for Brenna? Carl? David?
I wanted to ask, I don't know if you have a view on this at all, doesn't matter if you don't, but I wanted to ask about Maria Gimbutas, who I think popped up really briefly somewhere else.
So the original version of this talk was me comparing the Elaine Morgan, the citation network was Elaine Morgan and Mildred Workoff, who was also very wrong about multi-regionalism. And then Maria Gimbutas and Ian Hodder. Oh, sorry, not Ian Hodder, James Miller. So there's another version of this talk that has more information on Maria Gimbutas.
I mean, some people would, I think Colin Brentford got on not long ago and made a big statement along the lines of, well, Maria Gimbutas was sort of right about all the things. But I never really understood what happened with Maria Gimbutas. us in the 1990s, where it seemed to become almost mandatory for anyone who wanted to be, an archaeologist writing about gender to say something nasty about her work. And I'm sure the citation pattern for her must be extraordinary because it's almost become taboo.
Yeah, no, it's amazingly. I don't have it on this. It's amazingly linear. It's basically like Hoddermother. Like there's a bunch of Neolithic sort of stuff. And none of the Joan Giro or McConkeys or anything touch it with a pole.
Why is that?
So there is some I think there may have been some personal issue at some point, but I think again it's the same network issue in that Marija Gimbutas was a Lithuanian archaeologist coming out of a very different tradition from Berkeley feminism. Just very, very different. And I get the impression that she did not speak about gender in archaeology the way gender in archaeology was being spoken about by most vocal practitioners. I think there's some other stuff, and there's some very, very bad blood between persons who support the work of Marija Gimbutas and other persons, which we can discuss after the live stream ends.
Any other guy?
What will happen if you run this in French or in Italian, for example, the two different things?
I think first I need to get a co-author.
Your feeling.
So the only thing that I got recently is because there's quite a lot of German-speaking works that cite Marija Gimbutas, which is this other side analysis I did. I think it depends on the structure of the academy. I suspect that the Anglophone world doesn't do that badly when compared to, and that's just based on things like overall sort of gender parity in the academy statistics. But I don't actually know. It'd be fascinating to do it somewhere like Greece or Turkey, where there has been a lot more equality in the gender of academics because the academy themselves are relatively new, or 100 years old or something like this, a little bit more. But it'd be very interesting to find out. You could do it, but you'd need to have some spoken languages.
I wonder how it is. I wonder how it is in New York and how they teach New York State archaeology, because that's predominantly run by a lot of women.
So the thing that I did not get a chance to do, which I thought would have been really fun, would be to compare the syllabus of Introduction to Gender Archaeology, which is of course you can take in Berkeley.
Yeah.
This is, so there are other ways to go about introduction, but there's also, you have to, I guess, deal with different teaching approaches. So four-field approach in the States versus here, we are really a specialist archaeology institute. We focus on scientific archaeology, excavation, and theory.
Yeah, I'm just going to observe that a lot of this is to do with class as well. All these early women are upper class women. And I think that's probably true in most of these different archaeological traditions. And I mean, it would be interesting to do these studies for Spain, for Iberia, because my sense there is there probably are more women within that tradition. But it's also then a kind of gender within the upper class, because the kind of the older brothers and sons go in to be doctors and lawyers, and the daughters and sisters are allowed to be kind of dilettantes in academia.
Yeah.
So I think there's those kinds of connecting issues there as well. It would be interesting to look at in that kind of broad context.
Yeah, there has been some work done, which I am now obviously forgetting who did it or why. I'm pretty sure it wasn't me. I thought it was really interesting. So again, the situation, Spain, Greece, Turkey, archaeologically have far more women represented at a higher level and continue to today because of the nature of how those academies were created, either post-war or post, total refounding of the state. and they have a very different background. Say that American, 1920s, everything's going great, the economy's roaring, let's become archaeology professors. But it's super sort of, I think Trailblazers itself is still trying to work out the best way to talk about the massive, there's a bunch of rich ladies in hats. And, we need to move beyond that if we're going to talk about stuff that sort of matters now. Or maybe that's the stuff that matters now too. That's, but yeah, I think it is something that should be made a little bit more explicit, possibly, when we talk about gender archaeology. I think somewhere on that thematic map it does say class towards the later stages, so maybe we're good.
Any other questions? I have a question. So you talk a lot about, you talk about networks. You talk about networks and citation and so on. And I'm just wondering in terms of, and how these remain unchanged, or what, if I understood right, some of the networks are like women helping women or promoting women and these sort of things, and citing other women and stuff. So if we're gonna, let's say, if we were to take it on the Institute to address this issue, how do you break those networks, or how do you break those little silos or forms of?
So I probably have two. The simplest thing to do is to look at your research network, to look at, I'm co-authoring a paper with 4 people. Do they all look like me? That is the first question you ask. It's the same thing you would ask if you were going to sit on a panel. It's the same thing if you would ask if you were going to join a company. It's like, am I just staying in my own network, or is this open and inclusive? So, it may be that you have 3 people and they all happen to be of one particular gender or race, but you do have to instinctively ask yourself, is this what's happening? So I think that's just being aware that we perpetuate these networks without thinking about them, and just taking every time you set up a new collaboration, every time you set up a new conference panel, just you stop and you go, am I, all white rich women in this? Or whatever it is. And the second thing, I'm a big fan of the idea that, because people aren't really great at changing their own behavior sometimes, that we should reward collective structures. So things like geniuses, things like single PI Nature paper amazingness is not really a collaborative network building exercise. It doesn't bring anyone else in. Having things like research funding for a variety of reasons, which I've certainly talked about later, but not necessarily to do with this, but having research funding that specifically asks, for instance, for collective research leads, forces you to build a network. And if you're thinking about making that network more diverse, it gives you the opportunity to do it, gives you an excuse to do it, and allows, some nudge basically towards doing that. There's a variety of other reasons it's good as well, but yeah.
Right.
There's free booze
Well,
in the
if
other
anyone
room.
wants to, I've written a paper on urban archaeology, so.
Would you
Get in touch with me. All right, thanks again to Brenna.
Thank you for listening to that.
There's some wine next.